Okay, right. It finally went live. I did press the button. It just didn't work twice. Oh my God, I hate technology. Okay. I don't know what to do. I guess hopefully people will join. Just give them a minute. Great, we have at least viewing, so to just like let some more people. Yay, awesome. Okay, so let's get going then, because people are starting to join in. Sorry for all the technical difficulties, everyone. It just, I thought we were going live, and then we hadn't, and then I thought we were going live again, and then we hadn't. The third time is the charm. Chuki's not here today because she is busy speaking at an Android conference somewhere in, I think she's in Texas. But that's okay because I have my special co-host, Feministi, also known as Nante. Yay! Great, and so we have Judith Williams. She's going to talk about creating inclusive presentations. I'm really excited about this because Judith and Talia have been trying to get us to do a webinar with us since like April. Probably right after she told Eric Schmidt he should stop interrupting Megan Smith at South by. So Judith is my hero, and I think she's going to be amazing. And then we also have Boris from Contentful because Contentful is sponsoring us today. So Boris, do you want to tell us a little bit about Contentful?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. It's basically you get all the admin part of a normal CMS without the front end, so you can plug it into any kind of application you want to build that has some content. And that's basically it. And I work on the iOS SDKs there. And if you want to build some kind of app that needs a CMS backend, you should totally check us out.
Awesome. Thanks, Boris.
Thanks.
Okay, so Judith, we worked together at Google. You were, I'm going to say, the only HR person I actually liked and respected.
Well, I appreciate that. At least you had one HR person.
It's true. And that's more than most companies, I think, right? Maybe we're just going to say no comment. And now Dropbox have an HR person who I'm sure they like and respect you. So I know that you worked a bunch on kind of unconscious bias and stuff. So do you want to kind of start talking to us about the kind of things to keep in mind when you're trying to create inclusive presentations, and especially like I think we've kind of going beyond the kind of 101 stuff. What else can we be mindful of?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing to start with is to know who your audience is, and that seems like something really simple. You can look at it and you can assume that you know who the audience is, right? You know the of the audience. Certainly. You know the gender of the audience. You know presumably people's ethnic origin, but there's a lot that you can't tell. And sometimes in a desire to connect with the audience, we tell stories that actually have the impact of creating a profound disconnection. And in one example, I was at an event. It was supposed to be a team offsite, a team bonding event for our larger HR team, and we had a speaker come in, and she was talking about how you find your inner genius. And the story that she told was how she had an illness and she was struck blind. And this was the worst thing that she could imagine happening to her. And so she was telling this as a story of her triumph over adversity, because she was able to go through physical therapy and have a number of surgeries, and in the end, she wasn't blind. But what she didn't know is in the audience was someone who actually was blind and had had a similar experience, except she didn't have that triumphal narrative of conquering blindness. She still lived with being, she had some vision, but being basically legally blind and dealing with all the challenges that someone who is visually impaired deals with. And what she said to me after it was over is she said, it's so exhausting to hear your life articulated as the worst thing that could happen to someone. So we need to be sensitive that sometimes stories that might seem to be these wonderful stories actually have this impact of disconnecting us from our audience. So I think it's really important to imagine all the different ways that anything you say might land. And another really important piece of that is to know yourself. And when I say know yourself, I mean know your biases. And so I've done a lot of work on unconscious bias, and we can think about our unconscious bias as the blind spots that arise because of errors in the way that we process data. And often the way this manifests is that we normalize our own experience, and we can't imagine an experience that is outside of our own. So we do this with knowledge and information. And when we have presentations, we get really excited. We're like, I'm going to tell you all this stuff that I know. It's going to be really fantastic and really great. But we don't recognize is that our way of knowing can actually be a system of power that disenfranchises people. So we need to be thoughtful about where are we getting our information. And we should also think about who is telling the story that we might be repeating. So we might be the expert in our field, but usually there's a basis in our field. And if we notice that our field has excluded people of different backgrounds, we want to ask the question of why. And it's not saying that we shouldn't continue to build that expertise in that field, but we should seek out other ways of knowing. I'm really fond of books, and in fact, I have a PhD in literature, and I used to teach great books classes. So it's not that we can't revere and love those great books, but understand the stories that aren't being told. And I often, when I do my unconscious bias presentations, I wear a pair of shoes, which I call my unconscious bias shoes. And they are a pair of Christian Louboutin shoes, which I bought a couple of years ago, and they are flesh-toned. Now, when you think about flesh-toned, you don't stop to think that for a long time, anything that was considered flesh-toned was actually either pink or beige. And if you are my color, which is not pink and not beige, flesh-toned is one of those blind spots. And so finally, Christian Louboutin realized that there was this opportunity to say, hey, there are different ways of understanding what it means to be nude or what it means to be flesh. It's also really important that we think about what is included and what is excluded. So again, it's about those biases and what do we normalize as something we don't even question. And I think a lot of times, especially when we're giving a presentation and we're something of an expert in a field, we have some blind spots about the story that we are not telling. So I think we need to often start with, well, what are the goals of our presentation? And sometimes we think that the goals of our presentation might be one thing. I'm going to convey this knowledge. But if we dig under that, we might find that there are other goals, right? We want to persuade people to a certain point of view. We want people to feel a certain way. I think being really honest with yourself about what those goals can really help. And in thinking about setting those goals, think about who's included and who's not included, and think about why. Think about what that actually means. And I think we also want to think about the types of metaphors that we use, and even thinking about, like, if we think about metaphors of space, oftentimes when we talk about difference, we talk about the geographies of space in different ways. So if we think about how we talk about people who might have learning disabilities, we talk about placing them in a different program, right? We talk about them in this sort of otherness, where our kind of geographies and metaphors of space are othering them. So we want to think about what ways are we falling into those types of patterns where we other people in our language, or we other people in our very common metaphors. And we also want to think about, we're telling a story. Even if we think we're talking about, just data or information, we're actually telling a story. And so what that means is that some things or individuals are going to manifest positively in that story, and some are going to manifest negatively. And when we're crafting a story, we have the ability to either reproduce all of the types of stereotypes and biases that exist in our society, or we have the ability to undermine them. So we want to be thoughtful about what's the framework and perspective that we choose, so that where we can, in telling this story, we undermine those assumptions. At the same time, I think it's really important, especially if we're trying to tell a story with empathy and openness to other points of view, is that we recognize our own limitations. So we all enter in a certain way. So I am the body that I am. I am always going to be a woman. I am always going to be a woman of African descent. There are things that I don't know. There are things that I can't know. And trying to be all things for everyone, that we can't do that. I think it's important to recognize that. And so as you are developing any content, think about the limitations of your story. Think about how you can be inclusive, but always understand why. And I think sometimes we have to exclude, right? We can't tell everything, but be transparent first with yourself and then with your audience about why you're making those choices. And let them know up front, my goal is this. I'm going to tell it in this way. I recognize that this might not be included. Here's why. And maybe it's because I don't have the expertise to talk about an area, and I refer you to someone who actually does. But that's validating those alternate perspectives and ways of being.
That's great. I love that you have unconscious bias shoes. I just think that's the coolest thing ever. Like, I think often when we go and speak, we put on something that is like for us to symbolize part of the performance. I saw someone speak recently, and she was dressed in Italian purple, and afterwards she said to me, "Purple is my power color." I was like, one, adorable, and two, like, what a great idea to go and put something on. When you go on stage, you're like, okay, I feel powerful. And so, like, I think your metaphor with the shoes is like, how can we take that further, right? Like, how can we put physical things around us that say, this is something that's really important for me to bring to this presentation? So I just want to remind everyone that, like, we take questions. Please ask us questions. And every time, y'all are slow to ask questions, and then we run out of time. And every time we tell you this at the beginning, and every time it happens again, I don't know what to do about it. So please just start asking questions. Me and Liz are going to keep reminding you to do that.
Constantly reminding you. But since we don't have any yet, I actually have a question that came up for me recently at a conference. It was my first time going to an international conference that might have people who don't speak English as a first language, who have non-U.S. cultural differences. It's just a different country, a different city, a place I had actually never been to. And as a speaker for that, I wasn't really sure how to prepare for that. It's like, Judith, when you were talking about your audience, knowing your audience and knowing who's in your audience, what are ways that you would recommend speakers can prepare for those like cross-cultural different country differences, and how can conference organizers maybe help with that?
So I think part of it is you can ask a conference organizer to get a list of where folks are from so that you have some idea of where individuals are from. And then there's some things that you can do to actually make your presentation more accessible to everyone. And part of it is, if you're thinking about the way that you speak, I know that I lose people. So take a breath, slow down. Another thing that you can do is you can provide handouts to the folks in the audience ahead of time, so that for individuals that might not be able to follow you as you are speaking, they at least have the handout so that they will get something. And yeah, I think those are probably the biggest things, is to get as much information as you can ahead of time. Always remind yourself to slow down and just bring some collateral for individuals to engage in other ways. And that's also important if you're thinking about people have different learning styles as well. And so some of us actually learn really well when we hear people speak. Others of us don't. We need something to be written down, or we have kinesthetic learning. So recognize that.
How do you recommend? I'm big with text on slides. I love my text, and sometimes I put pictures, sometimes, always I put GIFs up there because everybody needs a little animated giggle every now and then. But for people who are kinesthetic learners, or that word that I can never say, people who learn that way, how do you recommend reaching out to them and making them feel connected to your presentation? That's the one I struggle with all the time.
I think in a lot of ways that's one of the more challenging ones for me as well. I actually think about how can I get people up and get moving. And so one of the things that I do is sometimes I do something as simple as ask polling questions, and I say, raise your hand if. And then if I can't see their hands, I say, raise your hands higher. And then if people aren't really engaging, I say, actually, I want you to stand up if this has happened. So suddenly people are moving and they're not just sitting in their chair, and you know that they're engaged. So I think about low-level participation things, because everybody can usually raise their hand, or most people can stand up. Beyond that, sometimes people get really uncomfortable, but thinking about what are some low-stakes ways that people can actually move around.
Move around and participate in a physical way. And a reminder, we're totally happy to convey your questions, so keep sending us questions, or I'm just going to keep chatting with Judith and having a great time by myself over here. I don't know, I think it's going pretty well. What about you, Judith?
I think it's going great. More questions.
Yeah, more questions. So in the event that you're at a conference and something happens on a slide that you think, ooh, maybe not, or are there ways that you recommend approaching conference organizers or speakers, perhaps, if you know the person? Like, how would you handle that situation as an attendee?
I think what you have to decide is who's your audience. And so is your audience just that speaker, or is your audience that speaker and the larger group? And
or is your audience Twitter?
Yeah, a larger audience Twitter. And so in the occasion where I was at South by Southwest and Eric couldn't stop interrupting Megan, I actually got the feedback that, that wasn't the right time to give him the feedback. But I disagree, because that was a room full of a couple thousand people, men, who were seeing that it was okay to interrupt a woman on the panel. And so as much as I was asking him and Walter Isaacson, who was the other man on the panel, about unconscious bias and about their behavior, I was also calling it out so that the other individuals in the room could see it and understand it. And so I think you have to decide what kind of stake you want to put in the ground. For most of us, it's easiest to pull the person aside, the presenter, and say, I noticed this. I assume you had good intent. I understand the point you were trying to make, but here's how it resonated for me. And I can imagine I'm not alone in the audience of having it resonate that way. Usually people are pretty positive, and I think it makes sense to talk to the organizers and say, I noticed this, and maybe we can create some guidelines for presenters so it doesn't happen again.
One tip that a friend told me once is, she said, sometimes if you approach somebody that you don't know and aren't familiar with, to tell them you were bothered by something in their slides so that maybe they shouldn't do it next time. She said sometimes just saying, hey, that wasn't cool, is like a really low bar to state that you didn't appreciate something. Mm-hmm. And so like you said, I would never ever feel comfortable going up to an individual speaker. I would never feel comfortable raising an issue in front of thousands of people in a room, even though that issue had such a strong impact and still is resonating. And thank you for doing it. But there are other avenues.
Thank you so much for doing it. Like, as a woman who has been interrupted in meetings so many times, like, I felt like that was one for all of us.
Yeah. We appreciate you taking that sacrifice. And so just a reminder, keep bringing questions to us. We'll keep asking them for you. So we have a question here specifically about preparing slides. What are specific checks that you do when you're reviewing your own slides and presentations? And are there any questions that you might ask yourself to make sure that things aren't either offensive or violating codes of conduct?
So I would say the first thing that I try to think about for my slides are basic accessibility. So there are maybe individuals who either can't see or see very little, who can't hear or hear very little. And so I try to make sure that if I do have videos, I have captions. If I am going to use images, it's important for me to actually describe what is in the images so that people can't see, feel included. And also, if we're going to use text, your text should be big enough that the individuals in the back of the room can see it, and you want to make sure that the contrast is high. So that's basic. How do I make my presentation universally accessible? Those are universal design principles. And then I want to think about, am I using a variety of examples? Do I use male examples? Do I use female examples? Do I have, if I have images of people, am I thinking about people of different abilities, people of different ethnicities? Am I also thinking about whether or not the images might be reproducing inequities that already exist? So I ask myself that question too. So if I have women in the presentation, but they're always in the background and the men are in the foreground, I'm gonna think about that and say, well, maybe I need to think differently about that. And thinking about that in terms of representation of ethnicities as well. And I think ability is a really big one. A lot of times we forget that there are people of different abilities and we don't represent them in the examples that we use.
Yeah, definitely. I know one thing that helps me a lot when I'm making slides, if I'm including pictures of actual humans, like human beings who do things. I think, what do I want my actual workplace to look like? And then I try to get photos of that instead of what, places look like now. Like,
right.
Let's dream big, let's dream big.
Aspirationally, that's really great. A lot of times people will say, and I'll say, well, I'm just doing it that way because that's what we see. And
too bad.
Why not think bigger? Why not be aspirational? See what you want to see, not what you actually see.
Yeah,
that is the quote of the day.
See what you want to. Yeah, it's true. This is what Chuki and I do a lot with Technically Speaking, because we like try and curate this vision of the tech industry that we wish we saw. And so we always, all our content, it's always like more than 50% women. And we actively look for other underrepresented groups, although we don't track it because I don't want to get like weird and stalkery on people. Like, did you qualify in some of the diversity check box based on my online background check of you? Like, I'm just not going to do that. But I think a lot of these tips also apply for writing. What do you think, Judith?
Yeah, I think they absolutely do apply for writing. And I try to be very selective, like in using my pronouns, for example, because oftentimes we use the kind of rhetorical he or she. And I think about, when do I want to employ the she and when do I want to employ the he? And I think that I've actually had the privilege of being able to talk to a lot of Hollywood writers, and they really will default to that verisimilitude. And they'll say, well, plumbers are men, for example, so of course I'm going to write plumbers as men. And you ask them that question, well, why couldn't it be a woman? Why couldn't that be a person of color? And usually there isn't a good answer for why it couldn't be something that you first imagined it, other than we've always seen it that way, or it's a blind spot or a bias that I have.
And it's always easier to just continue working with those biases. We all know this. It's how we are where we are now. We've got some more questions. Keep bringing them in. We've got lots of time so far left still. We've got another question about being inclusive. It's a hard thing to do. It's really difficult to make sure that you're calling out the people you want to call out and not forgetting people, which the industry does all the time. How do you go about actually making sure you're being inclusive without putting too much pressure on yourself or your fellow speakers or conference organizers?
I think it is a balancing act, and I think we never want to make our ideas about inclusion seem like they're actually weapons of exclusion. So I think having a perspective in terms of is important, making that clear, because that makes less work on presenters or people who are creating the presentations. And I think for someone who's creating a presentation, create just a really short checklist for yourself. And it can be 3 questions. I think about the Bechdel test as a really interesting, simple guideline for movies. And it's really simple. Are there 2 women who have names? Do they talk to each other about something that is not a man? right? So think about what your checklist is, like your simple thing, where actually the bar is so low because we are so used to the exclusion that we see. Even taking simple steps can move the discourse quite a bit.
Can you make that checklist for us, and we can call it the Williams slide test?
It says.
That would be so helpful.
Wow, on the spot, I would say, I would say, are the people on your slides different from you? So that's the one thing. If you have people, are you showing people who might be different from you or outside of your own experience? Are you showing a variety of types of people doing different types of things? And then the last question is, are you actively trying to challenge any of our stereotypes and biases? Those would be the 3 things to think about.
That was pretty good off the cuff.
Yeah,
put a lot of pressure on you.
Sorry, I'm pretty sure that Catherine has been taking notes on that, and Catherine, I'm just going to say you should tweet so that we can retweet you. I think about and so I was at Grace Hopper last week, and I wish they did a better job with inclusion. I see things getting better, but change often doesn't happen on a time frame that is the time frame we want. And I think, especially in kind of women's organizations, people think that there's some magical inclusivity thing that happens when you get a bunch of women together, and this is just clearly not true, especially when it's a bunch of white women. And so many things that really stress me out on that. But one really, I feel really easy thing to fix is that when we talk about role models for women, can we stop talking about only women who are dead?
That would be super helpful. I would really love that.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Who are your live role models for women? Not that Grace Hopper and Ada Lovelace, yeah, they're really cool, but are there any technical women left alive? It's not clear. If you just listen to presentations about inspiring technical women, you would think that they all died 10 years ago, and I don't know what the rest of us have been doing, really.
Just typing. That's all I do for a living. I'm an overpaid typist.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. And I think there is I think it takes us a while to catch up. And we tend to, we want our heroes to be perfect, and I think as feminists, we're so scared that they might do something wrong. So as long as they're still alive, we're like, uh-oh, what, I think about Hillary, who's going through this horrible trial of fire yet again. And I think that there's this fear to actually just get behind women who are still working and doing things, and we need to own that more.
And we need to support each other and support the women who've come before us who are still here and fought through worse shit than we probably fight through to be here.
Yeah, it's totally true. I'm a big fan of The Good Wife. I don't know, do you all like The Good Wife? Mm-hmm. I just finished, I think it was season 6, and it's where she runs for office.
Oh, spoilers! Oh, God!
Well, that starts at the start of season. Oh, sorry, spoiler. Anyway, it was they just took every fear that women have of running for office, and they made it into TV.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it was a little. It was hard to watch. It was brilliant, and it was just also just terrifying. It was like a horror movie, except no blood, no gore. Just all the other stuff that happens to women who, are brave enough to be public and ambitious.
I think we just have to remember that women who behave are seldom the women who make change. So don't be afraid of behaving badly. Just do it.
This is very true. And another one that I hear a lot is it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is to ask permission. So apply those both, and it'll work out. So we've got a couple more questions, but keep sending them in. We've got some more time, specifically on the vein of images and slides, images of people, robots, cats, etc. Do you have any resources that you like? It's really hard to find inclusive images that are in the public domain that include people from underrepresented groups.
I definitely agree. I like, there are some Getty images that they allow people to use either free or very low cost. So I like Getty Images because they have some cool things for photographs. I often will just type a Google search for whatever I'm looking for and say, free, open source images, and then try to make sure I check the attribution. Another thing that I try to do is to take my own images, or when I see individuals who have cool individuals, I ask them to kind of, if I can use them. So those are some tactics that I use, but Google search is generally my best friend, especially when I need those niche images.
And if you are listening and you have a resource, tweet it at us, at Technically Speaking, not at me, because, you can tweet it at me if you want, but it might be better to tweet it at Technically Speaking, and we'll collect all these things together and put resources together for everyone to include. I really like the tip about making your own images. I had never thought of that. So, you take images of yourself and just put them on your slides, or, pictures of friends, pictures around the office.
So less pictures of myself. But, for example,
when it comes down through the slide and it's, pointing at the thing, there's so much of that I had never thought of taking my own. That's a really good idea. That's, a fantastic idea. And I'm going to do that all the time now, but not of my hand because it's white, and who cares? We have enough of those. Any more questions, keep typing them in, and we'll keep answering them. And one thing that...
I'm sorry. I think it's a bit of a laugh, so I keep, accidentally... Liz, I'm sorry. There was a blog about kind of having different colored hands. I think it was on Medium. I keep seeing it go by, but I've not had time to read the internet this week. But there's some good resources there for creating and using different images to kind of demonstrate inclusivity in these images. I think that we've kind of, I think people now get roundly mocked if they only show slides with white men on them. But so then they add a few white women. Okay, cool. And then these kind of subtleties are actually they're a really powerful statement if you take the time to them and they're kind of thoughtful about it.
And one thing to remember is your photos don't have to be from the cover of a magazine. You don't need National Geographic quality photos. These are tech conference slides, people. You've seen, I'm sure we have all seen some really terrible slides in our days, and some really not great quality photos. The fact that it's there, I think, is more important than it being magazine worthy. Genuine, authentic photos of genuine, authentic people, I think, are a lot more important. And at least resonate with me as a human being more than your, high quality, amazing photo that I could never take.
Yeah, I think sometimes the polish, we hold ourselves high.
If asking questions, y'all. Sorry?
No, I think sometimes we shouldn't be afraid to be unpolished. I'm just underscoring what Liz said about, your photos don't have to be perfect.
I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. I just like to use animal pictures, but I think I could be more thoughtful about, including humans.
Yeah, and then there's the whole cats versus dogs debate, and you just don't want to get involved in that, Kate.
No. Well, my last one was owls, and the one before that, there was a raccoon.
There are always meerkats, which are actually pretty cute.
So keep asking questions, and we will keep answering.
One thing I want to...
Oh, I think Kate has a
one
little...
thing I kind of wanted to come back... Oh my god. Can you not hear me? Am I lagging too much?
You can go. I just talked over you because we went, and it did explosion.
Technology, how does it work? One thing I wanted to come back around to was this geographic thing. Because definitely, again, at Grace Hopper last week, we talk about being the celebration of women in computing, but then all the data, all the talks, it's all women from North America. Just would think that no side of San Francisco, 100 miles away from San Francisco, and it's really depressing as someone who has managed to successfully avoid living in San Francisco.
We lost everything before within 100 miles of San Francisco, unfortunately. There, Kate, if you want to repeat that beginning bit.
Oh, well, if it was,
Kate
I
is
think
travel-related, has international internet, so.
Kate has international internet every webinar, and somehow, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're perfectly clear.
Okay, until I want to make a point, it'll be fine. So again, at Grace Hopper last week, there was this whole rhetoric around like, oh, with the celebration of women in tech, but we only talk about like women in North America, and then women in developing countries, and the women in developing countries, we give awards to for the great work they've been doing, and like, I totally think these women deserve awards, but this rhetoric that like tech only happens in San Francisco, if it happens anywhere else, like, it's kind of largely ignored unless it's happened in a developing country, in which case we should give someone an award. And like, I don't think that's like a healthy dynamic.
Not at all. It's really bad.
Yeah, we should be very careful about sort of, again, like how we think about geography and how we, and I think, and I am an American, so I'm going to own this. I think in the U.S. we are very used to believing ourselves to be the center of all things. And that is one of our blind spots. So when and certainly living in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley area, there is this perception that all things tech happen here. And if you want to do anything in tech, you have to come here. And that creates, I think, an echo chamber where we create the same type of technology solving the same types of problems. And if we want to think about what are the new frontiers, or what can tech really do, we need to break out of those geographies. And we also need to, even within a single city like San Francisco, we need to think about the way we circumscribe space and say that spaces, certain spaces, usually spaces that are occupied by ethnic minorities, are unsafe, and spaces that are not occupied by ethnic minorities are somehow better or not safe. And we need to think about that in our discourse too. And we also need to think about that as how we look at the rest of the world. And I think in the US, everyone is developing or not quite good enough. And that's a problematic perspective, right? And I think Grace Hopper, there are a lot of things that Grace Hopper could do better, and I think you've hit on one, for sure.
One of a very long list, unfortunately.
I'm in Colombia right now, and people get so judgy about Colombia, and it really annoys me because it's a beautiful country. I spent like quite a lot of time here now. Nothing bad has ever happened to me in Colombia. People have only been kind of kind and welcoming and lovely and taught me bits of Spanish. But especially when I hear it from Americans, I'm kind of like, the most dangerous place to go, San Francisco.
America, San Francisco, yes. The Embarcadero BART station, specifically.
Yeah. Walking on Embarcadero, a young woman was shot randomly by a man in broad daylight a few months ago in San Francisco, in one of the safe neighborhoods in San Francisco. So discourses of safety, I think, are often coded discourses of race and exclusion.
Right. It's super, people talk about Pablo Escobar, and like the man died 20 years ago, like it's very different here now. And like I really hate the rhetoric. It's somehow, I think kind of the trouble in Colombia ended around the same time as the trouble in Northern Ireland. But you don't hear people being judgmental about Northern Ireland anymore because, it's full of white people.
Yeah, and we have to be really careful not to fall into these biases when we're traveling, especially like you, Kate, you travel to Colombia all the time, and so I'm sure that people bring this up to you all the time, and you have to be prepared to be okay with disagreeing with people and saying, no, that's not the case, and maybe educate someone a little bit. While being in that position can be difficult, sometimes it is necessary. And so keep asking questions. We have more time for questions. I see a couple feed that we haven't answered yet.
Oh, sorry, like we're lagging. I said I think people just think I'll go anywhere because I went to North Korea, and so they just think that my judgment is like flawed. But whatever, I get to see the world, so I'm fine with it.
You promised that we were going to Kazakhstan, Kate, so I'm still waiting.
whenever you want to go. Do you want to go in November?
Yeah.
Impromptu international travel, everyone.
Kazakhstan, I think, is the place with the hole full of fire, or maybe it's supposed to be the world's second most bizarre country. One or the other. But either way, I'm totally sold.
So going back to the questions, we have another question about working on your slides, and also I think this applies a little bit to writing as well. Representing yourself, representing different people. How do you be careful not to step into cultural appropriation territory, and how can you help yourself feel out that line?
So I think with slides and writing, they're going to be a little bit different. Certainly with slides, having images of people from different backgrounds is called American vision of a family. Or we could say, what would a family look like someplace else? Displaying a family, I think, in that way, it's not a cultural appropriation. You're just using an example of an idea like a family. And I think often with slides, with our images, we can be creative in that way because we're saying this is just an example of this concept, family. This is an example of this concept, office, and I'm displaying this type of people. I think with stories, when you're thinking about trying to tell a story, you do want to be thoughtful about whose story that you tell. But part of that, I am someone who believes in empathy, and I do believe that individuals can tell stories about others who are not like them. Because I think when we get to that only only black people can tell black people stories, only women can tell women's stories, that's dangerous. The problem has been that for a long time, if you're a man, you can tell anybody's story. So we need to make sure that we are all comfortable telling each other's stories. And that starts with doing the research and understanding the perspective and the point of view. And then also being honest about who you are telling the story and why you're telling the story and why you think it's important.
And specifically why you need this story. Does it have to be this story? Does it have to be this culture to illustrate your point?
Right.
And I think that's where lots of people misstep sometimes with the whole cultural appropriation issue is how do I decide if I'm using this because it's a convenient stereotype that exists in our culture that we have here that we rely on to use this as an example, or am I actually using this because it's an illustrative story with real human experience? And
and I think that stories, like the stories that they just fall into a stereotype or the narrative that I've already heard before, those are not the most interesting stories. The stories that surprise us and make us think differently about something that we thought we knew are often the stories that we remember and that resonate with us. So if we're thinking about telling that specific cultural story because we want to enlighten, we want to open perspectives, we want to change and convey something different, I think that that's often a really good goal to have in thinking about those underlying stories or images that we select.
Yeah, and telling that story in a positive way, not just using a trope as an excuse,
right?
Which is a hard barrier to walk. Excuse me. I'm getting over a cold, so I have a little frog that's just hanging out in my throat. So we got a question. Oh. Go ahead, Kate.
Sorry. One thing I've been seeing lately is men trying to use female pronouns in their writing. And so, like, what's his name? Horowitz, he did that whole book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and he throughout. The only stories he told were stories about men, except for the ones he told about his wife. And so kind of seeing people make an effort to kind of include stories from women, from people of color, like in the kind of interactions they had in the stories they recount, I think it's really important. Like the best book I read this year, and I'm like weirdly obsessed with this book, but it was Hot Seat by Dan Shapiro, and it's like a book about being a startup CEO. And like all the stories were about women. Amazing. It was amazing to read a book about being a leader in tech and to be related to is told in it. Like I can't like even describe like how transformational that was to me. And I want to see, like, I think it's just an example of how it's totally possible to kind of include other stories, and it's just a bit more work to do it, but it really pays off.
And I think it reminds me, I was having a conversation with a tech executive, and he was talking about opportunistic hiring. And sometimes there's an alignment between you have a role for someone, and there's a great person in your network who's suddenly a little unhappy and might be able to be hired. And he was saying, and what if that is a guy, and I'm trying to think about diversity hiring, and my response was, diversify your network ahead of time. Why is it that you don't have women friends, people of color friends, people who have different abilities who are already in your network so that you don't always have to default? Diversify your network. So in the same way, when I think about the examples of all of the only women that you can use as an example is your wife, you need to expose yourself to more women, and not women in books, women, real women. Like, have conversations with them, understand their experience, and keep opening yourself up to get to know real people. Because when you tell real people stories, those are real people, and you can use you can use your interaction with them as examples.
One thing that I found really interesting at Open Source Bridge earlier this year in Portland over the summer, Stephanie Murillo was giving a keynote, and one of the things that she said that really struck me, she's Dominican, and she said, I am marvelous, I am exceptional just by the fact that I exist in tech. Not because of the work that she has done, which is fantastic, not because of who she is as a person, which is amazing, but just because she's here. And that is something that we have to be aware of too. Like, we are including people because they're just a bunch of me's like lined up in a row, or a bunch of, the guy that sits next to me lined up in a row. And so just a reminder, keep asking questions. We've got a few more minutes going. We did get one question on Twitter that hasn't been put into the Q&A box yet, but I figured I'd ask it anyways. Age inclusiveness is kind of an issue in tech. There are not a lot of people that I see at conferences or at meetups or in the office that are plus or minus 5 years from my age. How can we go about being more age inclusiveness in our examples or storytelling or slides, that kind of stuff?
I think that's a great point, and I think that's a blind spot for me, certainly, as I'm aware of it, but it's certainly something, because we work in tech, you can imagine a world where no people who are older than, let's say, 40 actually live, even though we know that we are working with people who are older than 40, probably much older than 40, but we have this narrative in tech, and it is a narrative, and I think that the more that we can change that narrative, and we can do that in thinking selectively, thinking strategically about your slides. If you're using an example of a programmer, use an older woman with gray hair, and don't comment about it. Just have her be your example. Make people deal with that and reconcile. Wait, that's not, is she? What? Or what are they saying? That moment of confusion can be helpful, and the more that we think about how do we change that narrative, I think the more we change those representations, then we break that strong association with that Silicon Valley image of what a tech bro looks like. And we have to keep doing it. We have to do it for all categories. And I think that we should also think about it in our language and what we value. And when we think about, talking about new ideas, I remember I was in one of these seminars, and the presenter was talking about how younger brains have more nimble connections. And once you're over 35, those connections ossify. And I'm looking around, and there are people in the room over 35, and I'm like, so you lost this all. Because you essentially said we're not valuable.
Is he a neuroscientist? Did he have any kind of expertise to be asking or to be making these kind of statements?
Career coach.
Oh my God.
No. Mm-mm.
I mean, I knew the answer to that before I asked the question. It was a rhetorical question. But it filled me with rage. I'm like, people who just declare expertise in topics that they really know nothing about, that are completely massive as well. I'm zen. Everything is fine.
Yeah, the difference between pseudoscience and whether or not something is real, and it's really hard to keep track, especially the internet makes things a lot more exciting than they should be, Like those, I don't know how many of you saw the Airbnb ads that were circulating on the internet the other day about Prop F in San Francisco. It's really snarky, kind of nasty ads about hotel taxes, and nobody actually bothered to check if they were true until today when somebody wrote an article about it.
Yes, and Airbnb was kind of snarky in their response when they were confronted with it.
Yeah.
I just had a little rant about paying tax. I didn't really know what was going on. I don't really care. Just like whenever tech companies talk about tax, I just assume that they're trying to like exploit people more efficiently and call it innovation.
Uber for cats. We need Uber for cats, Kate. Come on.
I think that might be a little exploitative of cats. I'm not sure they'll be happy in this environment.
We might need Airbnb for birds. I mean,
Airbnb.
Airbnb.
That's amazing. I found this Twitter account that I follow, and it's an owl and a kitten, and they're best friends. But it's in Osaka. But you know, I'm happy to kind of make the trip out to Osaka to see an owl and a kitten being best friends. I think it'll probably be like a life highlight for me.
Dream big, Kate. Dream big.
You know, I like to set myself very manageable goals.
That is so manageable. So you probably have time for one more question if anybody wants to throw anything at us. If not, we will keep talking to each other about adorable owls and kittens and, you know, maybe stuff that's actually on topic. Maybe. That was supposed to be like my grinning I'm convincing you to ask questions face. I don't know if the internet conveyed that super well.
Well, I mean, I guess we're like running out for our next presentation. Like, I feel like we covered like a ton of stuff here, and there's like so many things, but it can feel a little bit overwhelming. So for our next presentation, like, what would be like the one thing that you would say, do this to be better, and then it's something that we can keep working on at the time?
I think the one thing would be to question yourself, to say like, am I showing things from a different point of view, or am I representing a different point of view than the one that I always do, right? Or am I showing people who don't look like me? I think that moment of empathy, like figure out what your empathy question is so that you can make sure you're trying to think about it as someone else would see the presentation is probably the most important thing. Imagine if there were someone who were visually impaired in the audience and I told that story. How are they going to feel? Imagine if there were someone different from me. How is this presentation going to land with them?
I will say specifically to that point about images and visually impaired audience members, it helps a ton when conference organizers intentionally remind speakers to do that, to describe their images. Ash Dryden does that for AlterConf, and every single speaker at the Portland AlterConf described their images. And it's not something a lot of people instinctively think to do, but that's a really good example. So we've got one last question that will end us on, I think, no.
Well, speak up. What happens? Nobody listens to me. I'm really glad that you asked a question. Very
It'll
happy
be okay, Kate. It'll be okay. But in general, when we're talking about humor and we're talking about being funny, how do you actually check that you're funny? How do you, like, I think I'm pretty funny. I'm probably not. But, like, how do you confirm that what you're not going to go on stage and just say a joke and there will be crickets and you will be so sad?
So I think you need to try and see if your jokes land. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And you generally, like, you get to a certain point in your life and you know if you're funny or not because you're funny. People have been laughing at you. You're like, oh, wow, I'm funny. So if you think you're funny, Liz, you're probably funny. I'm funny. I know that. But one of the things that I will say about jokes is be very careful who the joke is on. Because you don't want to make jokes at the expense of individuals who are less fortunate than yourself. And that's really important. And so if you can joke up and it'll still be funny, but you can't joke down because that feels really bad. So what that means is that if you are at the top of a power structure, you need to be very careful about who the object of your joke is. It should pretty much always be you and people like you. If you're in a group that's more traditionally marginalized by society, then you have a little bit more latitude, but those are still dangerous jokes. So really think about who the joke is on. And it's okay if you have a joke and it doesn't land. if the joke's on you, it's okay. But if you're making fun of a cultural group or a group of people who's different from you and that joke doesn't land, it's really bad. So that's what I would say. Like, make your jokes, but just be mindful of who's the butt of the joke.
I think that's a really good test. Mine, that was really hard for me when I started speaking. When I'm nervous, I make fun of myself. And someone pointed out to me, it's really not empowering to see someone who looks like me on a stage giving a talk being self-deprecating. And I was like, oh, my heart. I'm so sorry. So like you said, joke up. Don't constantly make fun of yourself just because you're the easiest target. It's like you said, if you're at the top of that power structure, it doesn't mean that you have to make fun of yourself constantly. You're the person they see. You don't have to be the person you make fun of. So it looks like Kate, oh, she's coming back. She's coming back. Kate's rejoining us after losing her connection. But I think that that's all that we have for questions this afternoon. And Kate's back. Do you have anything that you want to say while we wrap up?
Just thanks so much, everyone. I'm sorry about the internet. I'm sure this happens in America, too.
All the time. I have really slow internet at home. I can't watch baby sloth videos. It's very upsetting.
Oh my God, I like sloth videos at home. Yeah, so I just, you were so fantastic. Thank you so much. I was been bugging you. Maybe I'll start next month and we'll do another one 6 months from now.
Awesome.
Cool, and once again, Contentful sponsored, which was really kind of them, and it allowed us to how to also do it.
We lost you. Wait. Almost. We're almost there. We almost got you back.
Hello.
Not quite. So close.
Just.
It sounds like you're singing a digital bird song.
Oh my God. Good song?
That's better. You're back. Talk fast.
Okay. Quickly. All right. If any of you also want to donate to Planned Parenthood, I understand this reproductive health. You know, let's keep women alive. And thank you so much.
Okay, so Kate cut out again, but she said thank you. I swear she said thank you. I'm pretty sure she said thank you. But big, big thanks to Judith. And thank you to everybody for their questions. And we'll see you next time. Bye! Hopefully Kate will end it, or else I'll just be on air forever.
I actually stopped before people heard me, so I was like, thank you, goodbye. And then I pressed stop, so who knows, but it says it's still stopping, so I guess this is the outtake.
Maybe push stop 3 times, since we had to push live 3 times?
That's true. It said it failed to stop the broadcast.
Okay. Judith, you did a great job. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Are you in San Francisco, or are
I'm
you
in Portland?
Oh, you're in Portland. That's right. You said that. Sorry.
Yeah. It's very scenic.
I love the wall.
Yeah, it's pretty great. I've got a plant to keep me company. Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to get back to it. Thank you so much. You did a great job. It was super awesome to talk to you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was really fun. See ya.
Bye.